Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, wrote Leo Tolstoy famously in his opening line to Anna Karenina. But maybe if they'd all got together to discuss books, these families wouldn't have been so unhappy. Well, that's the suggestion of our next guests, Annie Persick and Dave Durant, who sat down to talk to me about their family book club. But what gave them the idea? Annie explained how they got started.
My parents are avid readers, and everyone in the family as well. And when they retired to the South Coast 10 years ago, they joined a book club. And every time we saw them, they would complain that nobody wanted to talk about the book and they just wanted to chat about holidays and grandchildren. And my brother's girlfriend at the time suggested that a solution would be to set up our own book club within the family. Originally, it was the six of us, my brother and his girlfriend, me and Dave, my husband, and my parents. And we met once every 6 weeks or so. My brother and his girlfriend are unfortunately no longer together, but the book club has survived and thrived. And we actually had our 34th meeting last month on my dad's 70th birthday after starting in December 2012.
Wow, that's fantastic.
It's been a very interesting experience because we have quite a different taste in books. So because we take it in turns to go around and choose a different book each, it means that frequently people have been exposed to the kind of genres that they wouldn't normally be reading.
What did you read for your dad's 70th?
It was my dad's choice, and he picked Skios by Michael Frayn, who is best known for writing farces. My dad apparently picked it specifically because he thought the representation of the female characters would annoy me. And I remember in my notes early on, I wrote, does not warrant a feminist analysis because it's too stupid. But at the meeting, we actually had a really interesting and in-depth conversation about representation and gender roles in fiction, and also the nature of farce and whether it needs to have a visual element to be successful, and the debate over author intention and reader interpretation. So pretty much any book can result in a really interesting intellectual conversation for us, I think.
To my shame, I have to admit that I actually didn't finish this one. Having got to about a quarter way through the book, I gave up in disgust because I didn't realise it was supposed to be funny. I think a lot of it is you have to have the right attitude for the books that you're going into, otherwise your interpretation may be completely off.
We're always chasing the books that sort of, as we say, spark debate. We're really interested in those book club books that generate really good conversation, and often the ones that work best are the ones that are quite divisive. I'm curious, within a family environment where I feel like there's no kind of social barrier holding people back, as to how polite they are, I'm wondering what those debates are like.
It's not usually too bad because we're relatively polite as a family. We don't tend to have screaming rows. But yes, the best conversations are definitely the books that at least some people didn't like. I remember I recommended The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern a couple of years ago because I loved it and wanted everybody to read it. And we got together and everyone just went, yeah, it was lovely. And then there wasn't really anything to say. But I am often quite surprised, still after 7 years, I'm still surprised by people's reactions, and I can't predict who will like a book, because another one I picked because I thought it was funny and because I thought it would be a light relief after some slightly heavier titles was Red Shirts by John Scalzi, which is definitely a comedy. And pretty much everybody hated it, apart from me. But you do have to be a bit careful not to take things personally when people are ripping your choice to pieces. And as I say, it does make for a better discussion.
We tend to start the book club by going around each person at a time and having a very brief summary of what they thought. And I remember a very memorable occasion of one of the books that I'd recommended getting around to one of the other people in the family, and they said, well, I just threw your book across the room.
Yeah, so that was perhaps a
Quite
bit
a strong
harsh.
opener.
Yes, exactly.
Where do you go from there?
Yes.
My mum and I did make each other cry one time, but again, that wasn't because we were being mean. It was because we were reacting to the mother-daughter relationship in the book, which was Elizabeth is Missing by Emma Healy, I think, which is about dementia.
One of the things that interested me so much was families can be incredibly close, but then the children grow up and they move away and they have their own lives. Often people don't live that near their parents, so we maybe don't see them that often. And then when you do get together, because you're all leading very separate lives, I feel like it's perhaps not easy just to talk in the same way as you did when you were all living together. And what I loved about this was I loved the idea that maybe it did give you something that brought you all together. Do you think it has helped your relationship as a family?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, not least just because it gives us a timetable by which we're actually going to all get together, because that doesn't happen that often. We don't live that far apart, and we tend to meet in central London, so my parents come up on the train. Also, because we have quite different tastes, it gives us something that we are all sharing together and discussing. I think my dad probably gets the short end of the straw because he likes very different kinds of books to us, so he tends to pick comedy or thriller, and the rest of us tend more towards fantasy and science fiction. So it's quite rare that any of us will really like the books that he picks, but he seems to be leaning into that and just going controversial, and I think he enjoys that.
I think if I did one with my family, my dad would just make us all read westerns.
Oh, we haven't had that so far. We've had pretty much everything else. We had a police procedural set in North Korea. We had a memoir about teaching Western literature to women in Iran. We've had 1950s science fiction. The one that I remember that probably stands out the most was one of my brother's choices. He picked 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher, which is a teenage book about a girl who commits suicide and then sends some cassette tapes posthumously to the people that she feels contributed to what happened to her, and they all have to listen to them in turn. I came back from a holiday to find a shoebox on my desk with no address or anything on it that had been hand delivered to my office. And inside was an anonymous note instructing me to listen to the CDs that were also in the box and then pass them on to the next person on the list. And then the opening of the book was the protagonist coming home and finding a shoebox on his doorstep with these cassette tapes in. So that made it quite an immersive, interactive almost experience.
Dave, is there anything that has stood out for you over the years?
The main one I remember is Annie's brother's ex-girlfriend chucking the book across the room. But
Yeah. And if you're both reading the same thing for the family book club, are you a bit like Laura and me? Do you have a rule not to talk about it between yourselves before you get together?
We do have that rule. It doesn't always work, because we usually are using the same copy, so we have to do it one after the other. Dave usually goes first, and I think I'm right in saying that he finds it quite difficult not to mention things as he's going along, so I have to kind of cut him off and go, no spoilers! And I'm guilty of that as well when I ring up my parents and I'm partway through the book, especially if it's one that they've picked and I want to kind of have a go at them for it or say that I'm really enjoying it, but we do try.
There's definitely a situation where you're reading quite a few books between the book clubs, and then you want to discuss them with your partner, and then you forget which one's actually the book club book, and you're like, oh, let me tell you about... Oh, I can't. That's definitely been a thing before.
That's very familiar. Laura and I have that all the time. Well, I've loved hearing about your family book club. Maybe as a final word, if people were thinking about starting one, any advice, anything to say?
I don't think it's really that much different from any other book club. I think scheduling is quite important because you're less likely, as you say, to be near to each other. So you have to be aware of other people's busy lives, but also make sure that book club doesn't disappear. Otherwise, as I say, it was more not taking things too personally, because I think it can have more potential for that. But yeah, it's pretty much the same as any other book club, really.
The main thing that I would say is don't pick books that you think other people in the group will like. So don't try to please people. Pick things that either you already like and have really interesting things that you want to talk about, or pick things that you want to read yourself. Because if you spend your time trying to do things for other people, you quickly find out that you don't know them as well as you think you do.
You've obviously kept going, you keep going back, you keep wanting to do another one. What is it you think that you're all getting out of it?
I think we all, as a family, like sharing media with the others. I have a particular connection with my dad over cinema, so he's always looking for film recommendations and telling me about things that he's seen that he wants to talk about. We like talking about the things that we read and the things that we watch. So yeah, I'm always, when I'm reading a book, thinking in the back of my head, is this a good book club book? I'm always looking for the next one on the list. It's definitely something that I look forward to.
For me, the thing that I most get out of it is diversity of reading, because without having this opportunity for people to come along and suggest things that are substantially outside of the sort of set of books that I would normally read, I would probably default back to the things that I'm most comfortable and familiar doing. So I've had a lot of really interesting experience of reading more widely. That's been really useful for me.
Annie and Dave, I've loved hearing about your family book club. Thank you so much for coming and telling me about it.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
Laura, what do you think of the idea of a family book club? Your family, I feel, are quite a literary lot. Would this work for you?
No.
Would it not? Really? Because your parents are both keen readers.
I know, but, just listening to Annie and Dave saying that they're quite a polite family who don't have screaming rows. I mean, well, my family do not have screaming rows regularly.
Someone at one point did throw a book against a wall in there. So.
Well, that's true. But my family were very close. We got on very well. But part of that is finding the right ways to spend time together, I suppose. And when it comes to reading, yeah, my mum and dad and I are huge readers. But my mum and dad have totally different taste. And actually, I just could see it becoming really divisive. So I'm not sure it would be a good thing for my family. But we do make recommendations to each other all the time.
I quite liked the idea. I did suggest it to my husband's family, who were a numerous clan, and was sort of mocked by a few people for the idea. But then a couple of people were like, oh, yeah, that would be nice. There's so many of them. I can't quite see that working with them. But my family, we're very small. There are only 4 of us. And we are all readers in our own different ways. Funny enough, my mum, who I don't think ever really had time to read when I was growing up. She's a teacher and she's just always really busy. But now that she's retired, her reading life has really flourished, and she is in a book club, and often now it's a nice point of discussion between the two of us. We're like, oh, what are you reading? And we have nice chats about the book she's reading. My dad is a real reader, but in his own kind of quiet way. He's a big fan of westerns, thrillers. He likes a good Jack Reacher novel. But again, frequently I'll pick up things from the bathroom shelf, which is where all his stuff is stored, and be quite interested, particularly some non-fiction stuff. And occasionally I'll pass something on to him, suggest something to him that will really strike a chord. He really liked Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Did we talk on the pod? Or we definitely did it for my book club.
But
really interesting history of mankind. But so I was kind of minded. I like the idea of people taking it in turns to pick. I think that's really interesting. And I think if you could make it work, like Annie and Dave's family have managed to make it work, it could be a really wonderful thing, because it could sort of draw you all together in the best way that book clubs do draw people together, and that could be really, really nice.
And also steer you clear of higher stake conversation, perhaps.
If you were to try and pitch to your family that they should do a book club, do you have an idea of a book that you think you could recommend that would hook them all in?
Yes, I do. I don't know if it would hook everyone in, but I think we could probably get most of us to read it. It is Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey. Subtitle, Understanding the Anger of Britain's Underclass.
Your parents are Canadians. Is your brother in Canada as well? Is this going to make any sense to them whatsoever?
No, my brother's in America, actually. But that's one of the reasons why I think it would be a good book club book. It's about poverty in Scotland. It's not even London, so it's beyond my knowledge as well. But Darren McGarvey just writes really beautifully, I think, about what it means to be a part of a community that is regularly ignored by the powerful and politicians, and who, when they do engage with it on their own terms. And actually, I think what I found so powerful about this book was its ability to turn a mirror back on my own privilege, and this is why I think it'd be good for my family too, we're all quite privileged, and say, your nice middle-class liberal beliefs are also problematic. There's things going on with those beliefs that have a lot of preconception wrapped up in it, and actually maybe you don't know as much as you think you do. I think it'd be a really good discussion. I also think that although we're a fairly liberal family, I think as we've moved around the world and don't live so close together, our politics have probably widened more than we think. So for better or worse, it would be a good book club discussion.
I also have a recommendation for your family. So your parents and you went off to Paris for a long weekend, and you stayed in my apartment there. And when you came back, your dad got me a book about this oyster restaurant as a present. Meet Paris Oyster, A Love Affair with the Perfect Food, which is, I think, a book based on this oyster restaurant that you all went to when you were there. That's really lovely. I'm so sorry. I haven't had time to read it yet.
Yeah.
No,
I've now been twice, and it has a pilgrimage. The first time my dad sent me and my husband, because he was like, oh gosh, you're going to Paris. Well, you have to go eat at that oyster bar. He literally paid for us to go and eat there and live vicariously through us. And then a year later, we were able to go, the 4 of us, which is a beautiful small oyster bar in Paris. That would be a good book club book. And you know what? I think all of the family would read it, because if we didn't, my dad would be sad that we hadn't indulged in his love of oysters.
Part cultural journey, part cookbook, and part slice of life play. This book introduces readers to the appetites, gastronomic and otherwise, of Paris and its people.
It's a lovely book, and it's very slight.
I will read it. I was thinking Educated by Tara Westover, which I just think is sort of great for all book clubs, really. It's such a good book club read, but might appeal to the different members of my family. So that's the story of a girl who grew up in this incredibly isolated way in her family's sort of farmhouse in Idaho. Her father believed they had to kind of hole up and keep themselves separate. And it's a story of how she, through her own kind of wit and intelligence, managed to escape this incredibly claustrophobic world and make a life for herself. And it's really moving. And I just think my mum would probably like it for the educational aspect. My dad, I think, would like it because he'd be interested in the whole scrapyard thing, because Tara Westover's dad was a sort of junk dealer. He'd take old bits of machinery and usually get his small children actually to sort of wield the blowtorches and strip them down. But I think my dad would find all that quite interesting. And so I could see that one working quite well for a book club book. Also, I was thinking there's a book called Time Song, which was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize, which is a kind of prize I've just recently discovered, and I love the Wainwright Prize. It's nature writing, books about nature writing. Julia Blackburn's Time Song is a book about the region under the sea between the coast of Suffolk and Holland, which used to connect us to the European mainland before the sea kind of came in. And she is very interested in collecting and fragments of things and building kind of history and stories. She wrote a really interesting book about this incredibly obscure sort of folk artist called John Crask, was it, that I really enjoyed. All of my family are quite interested in that region of Suffolk because my mother is from there. And so I think that would probably appeal to all of us. And my other suggestion was a book by Ed Yong called I Contain Multitudes, which is a groundbreaking, marvellously informative microbe's eye view of the world that reveals a radically reconceived picture of life on Earth. I came across this because I saw it on my dad's shelf and I picked it up and I started reading it, and it's really, really, really interesting. It's about the tiny, tiny microbes that exist inside of us and all living things and the natural world, and how it kind of keeps everything ticking over. And as one of those non-fiction books where you sort of read it and come away with a completely different way of thinking about life and existence. And I have a feeling that would probably work for most of us. So I'm minded to pitch this to my family and see. But
because you need another book club.
That's the real question: is could I?
No.
No.
No, you're not allowed
Would
another
4
book
be
club.
too many? Well, perhaps it would be pushing it too far. Anyway, I love the idea. I love Annie for thinking of it and her family for doing it and making it work. And I thought it was inspiring. That's all for this episode. A quick recap of those book club suggestions. Annie mentioned Skios by Michael Frayn, 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher, and Elizabeth is Missing by Emma Healy. Laura suggested Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey, and mine were Meet Paris Oyster by Mireille Giuliano, Educated by Tara Westover, Time Song, Searching for Doggerland by Julia Blackburn, and I Contain Multitudes by Ed Yong. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup by John Carreyrou. It's the best-selling book that reads like a Hollywood thriller, the true story of how the young, charismatic CEO Elizabeth Holmes drove her biotech startup Theranos to a 2015 valuation of $9 billion, and how that empire crumbled to nothing thanks to the dogged efforts of Carreyrou and a small band of whistleblowers who exposed the lies, intimidation and fraud it was built on. The book has been an international bestseller, and it's set for a Hollywood adaptation starring Jennifer Lawrence. But never mind all that, what did my book club make of it? Was it a good book club read? Listen in to find out. That episode is coming soon. But before that, we have our bookshelf show, in which we discuss the books we've been reading outside of our book clubs, the ones that we get to pick and choose. Among others, we'll be discussing Washington Black by S.E. Edwigan, Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams, and The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. Don't miss it. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you like what we do, please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It helps other listeners find us, it means you'll never miss an episode, and it makes us happy. But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.